Job defends himself one last time. And then a young man named Elihu pipes up out of nowhere, taking on Job's friends and their arguments, and even taking on Job and his arguments. And the Apostle Paul begins his letter to the Galatians. Today on 3-in-1, as we consider Job chapters 31 through 33 and Galatians chapter 1. Does he not see my ways and count all my steps? If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. 31 chapters in, and Job is still frustrated because he can't think of why or what sin God is punishing him for. And Job's three friends throughout all of this were saying, well, it must be something, some sin in your life, because that's what God does, Job, with sinners. He allows them to suffer. But they were all wrong. And hopefully we've learned enough by now to say emphatically that Job's suffering had nothing to do with his sin. So 30 times now around that roundabout, all for nothing. Well, I guess it benefits us reading this, as we've learned that there is not always a connection between suffering and sin. And we've learned how not to counsel and comfort our friends. Job called these miserable counselors doctors that didn't know what they were doing. And I think that's accurate. And so did Elihu. Wait, who? Yes, Elihu, who started to speak in chapter 32. Who is Elihu? And where did he come from? And what did he have to say? Well, we read some of his words today in chapters 32 and 33. And Elihu, unfortunately, reminds me a lot of myself. See, I sit and serve on a few different boards in our community for a few different organizations. And for each one, when I was invited to serve, I warned them that I'm usually very quiet, but I'm also very opinionated. So you may get nothing from me, or you may get the fire hose. And that's Elihu. For 31 chapters now, he sat in silence as his elders tried to convince Job of his unrighteousness. And that silence ceased only after the first verse of chapter 32, where it said, "So these three men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes." And then came the fire hose. In verse 2, it said, "Then the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, was aroused against Job. His wrath was aroused because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his three friends his wrath was aroused because they had found no answer, and yet they had condemned Job. Now, because they were years older than he, Elihu had waited to speak to Job. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his wrath was aroused. So Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid and dared not declare my opinion to you. I said, age should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. Great men are not always wise, nor do the aged always understand justice. Now, I must say, just because Elihu is younger and passionate, silent until this moment, until he unleashed the fury of his arguments on them, the fire hose, that does not mean that he had any more wisdom than them. And, I could say the same for me. I've sat in those meetings, listening, waiting, boiling over, about to explode because I'm so opinionated, because I'm so sure that my strong opinion is the right opinion. And then when given the opportunity to speak, I unleash the fury of my incredible wisdom, only to realize, often, unfortunately, while I'm speaking, that I should just stop talking and start praying. See, some of Elihu's arguments are original, but most of it is more of the same. And all of it is in error when applied to this particular situation. Really, all that Elihu did was barge his way into this exclusive group of miserable counselors, doctors that didn't know what they were doing. I mean, really. Listen to Elihu's introduction. Even before his opening argument, he spends almost the entire chapter rebuking Job's friends because they weren't able to convince Job that his suffering was related to his sin. So this is all passion and no content. It's all passion, but it's just hot air. in verse 11 we read today. I have waited all this time, listening very carefully to your arguments, listening to you grope for words. I've listened, but not one of you has refuted Job or answered his arguments. And don't tell me he's too wise for us. Only God can convince him. If Job had been arguing with me, I would not answer with your kind of logic. You sit there baffled with nothing more to say. Should I continue to wait now that you're silent? Must I also remain silent? No, I will say my piece. I will speak my mind, for I am full of pent-up words, and the spirit within me urges me on. I am like a cask of wine without a vent, like a new wineskin ready to burst. I must speak to find relief, so let me give my answers. So, what did we just see there? See, unfortunately, Elihu is really seeking only to serve himself in his ministry towards Job. And that is a really dangerous combination. Entering into the ministry to soothe some insecurity that you may have. Using the ministry to meet some emotional need that you may have. Needing to say something just so that you can say something. Needing to speak just so you can be heard. Motive in ministry is of the utmost importance. For if my motive is self-serving, then I really may do more harm than good. For example, Elihu. He's just so angry. He's angry at Job's friends. He's angry even at Job. And I get the sense that he looked at Job like a puzzle problem that no one else was able to solve. And so he finally said, well, let me take a crack at him. I bet I can convince him that his suffering really does have to do with his sin. And all of that said, there's one thing that gives me pause about Elihu, and we'll address it at the end of the book of Job, when God finally, graciously, and furiously weighs in on these words without wisdom. But until then, we'll have to endure Elihu's arguments. Mixed motives, misapplied truth, tons of passion, but also a lot of hot air. Most likely hurting much more than actually helping. So, what's the application? What's our prayer? Well, my prayer is, Lord, unless you are leading me to speak, help me to stay silent. Help me to pour out my passion to you in prayer. Okay, on to what we read in the New Testament today, Galatians chapter 1. We started yet another new book in the Bible today. And in the first 8 verses of the first chapter, we got a sense of the overall theme and tone of this letter. See, some had perverted the gospel of Christ, and some in Galatia were falling for it, and they were falling away. There's a great danger in wandering away from the core components of the gospel of Jesus Christ. See, the gospel of Jesus Christ is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not to be modified. It's not to be altered. It's not to be tinkered with in any way. When you do, it immediately loses its power, and it becomes just another one of these multitude of philosophies floating around our world today. And the particular philosophy that was floating around in Galatia was similar to what we will see later in the book of Hebrews. See, some were scared by grace, and they were retreating back into the law. And others, against the gospel, were capitalizing on this fear. And so, listen to the fatherly tone, the protective tone that Paul uses as he tries to protect them and pastor them in Galatians chapter 5, verse 7. It says, "You were running the race so well. Who cut in on you and held you back from following the truth? It certainly isn't God, for he is the one who called you to freedom. This false teaching is like a little yeast that spreads through the whole batch of dough. I am trusting the Lord to keep you from believing false teachings. God will judge that person, whoever he is, who has been confusing you. Dear brothers, if I were still preaching that you must be circumcised, as some say that I do, why am I still being persecuted? If I were no longer preaching salvation through the cross of Christ, no one would be offended. I just wish that those troublemakers who want to mutilate you by circumcision would go the whole way and emasculate themselves." Yeah, Paul was a little bit angry. See, Paul was a good pastor, and as a good pastor should, he's troubled that someone is troubling those he was charged to care for and protect. And he says, I wish those who were trying to pull you back into religion, pleasing God through works, specifically circumcision, the cutting away of the foreskin, would just go the whole way themselves and remove the whole thing. Yeah, that just happened, and that's what he said. And I'm glad that he did. Because if we only earn God's favor after impressing him with our works, where does it stop? See, if God loves me a little bit when I pray for 5 minutes, well, then God will love me more if I pray for 15 minutes. And he will love me even more if I pray for an hour, and on and on and on, and it just doesn't stop. But the truth of the gospel is that because of what Jesus has done, because of what Jesus finished, God loves you fully, completely, thoroughly, no matter what. God loves you the same whether you're serving him 24/7 or whether you're wallowing in sin. So serving him is not for his favor, but rather from his favor. Serving God is just the overflow of a heart that is grateful for grace. But if you put the cart before the horse in this one, it can be very, very destructive. And so there's a very serious tone throughout the letter to the Galatians as well. There should be. But let's not forget the irony here. See, Paul was formerly Saul, and he used to be the most zealous proponent of legalistic righteousness. And now he's a powerful preacher of grace. God's righteousness at Christ's expense, received by faith. So who better to write about the bondage of the law versus the liberty that we have in love, in this love relationship with God through Christ? So those are the two concepts that are repeatedly contrasted in the book of Galatians, bondage and liberty. And Galatians 5 verses 16 through 18 summarize this central theme. Paul said, I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. This is the liberty of the Spirit. And so in the letter to the Galatians, Paul encourages them, you have been called to liberty in Jesus. Stand fast in that liberty. Let no one seduce you with wise and persuasive words that appeal to man's way. For there is a way that seems right to a man. Religion seems right to a man. Earning God's favor, myself, seems right to me, a man. But in the end, that way leads to death. So, in the book of Galatians, in the letter to the Galatians, we will see a serious warning against returning to religion and a serious encouragement to stand fast in the glorious freedom that we have only in Jesus and only by the grace of God.